I sat in the conference room on the 17th floor of Novatech Devices, staring out the wide glass window flooded with Colorado sunlight. Below, Denver stretched out like a massive grid, every street a perfect line in a giant chessboard. 6 years ago, when I first joined Novatech, I'd stood in this same room with a heart full of hope, convinced I had finally stepped into my dream. Back then, I was a fresh MIT graduate, just a young engineer joining one of the leading companies in surgical robotics. I believed this was where my career would grow, where effort would finally meet recognition. Now, in that same seat, I spread out the documents I had spent countless nights preparing: performance reports, improvement charts, letters of commendation from partners. Across from me sat the leadership team: Victor Kane, the cold smiling CEO, Ellen, the CFO, Mark, the VP of Engineering, and three others lined up like judges in a contest I never volunteered to join. "Let's begin," Victor said, his voice calm and heavy. "Samantha, what do you want to present for this quarter's review?" I took a slow breath. Over the past 6 years, I've led the calibration group in developing a new navigation algorithm for the Nova Surge surgical robot line. We brought the margin of error down to 0.08 millimeters, a record for the industry. Because of that, we secured the contract with St. Mary's Hospital, generating $85 million in revenue last year. I flipped to the next page, keeping my tone steady. I also trained 12 junior engineers in calibration procedures to make sure we stay on schedule during high-pressure projects. I'm not asking for a bonus for any of that. I'm asking for an adjustment that aligns with current market standards. No one spoke. Ellen looked down at her notes. Mark tapped his fingers on the table. Victor leaned back, a faint smirk crossing his face. "I see you're passionate," Victor said slowly. "But Samantha, the market is tough right now. We kept you through several rounds of layoffs. That alone is recognition." My heartbeat thudded, but my voice stayed calm. "I'm not asking for privilege, just fairness. Here's the data from three leading surgical device companies, including salary averages for equivalent positions." I slid the folder toward them. Victor didn't even glance at it. He pushed it back like it was a brochure someone tried to hand him on the street. "You should be grateful you still have a job," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have hundreds of resumes waiting to take your spot. Average people get average pay. You want exceptional pay? Prove you're exceptional." The room let out a soft ripple of laughter, not loud, but sharp enough to cut straight through my pride. Mark avoided my eyes. Ellen tilted her head, almost pitying, but said nothing. 6 years of loyalty, 6 years of building better systems, fixing client issues at midnight, giving up weekends, sacrificing my personal life, and that was their answer. I nodded slowly. "I already have," I said quietly, "and the proof is right there." I pointed to the folder. No one moved. Victor shrugged. "You can return to your work. We'll review this again once the company's in a better position." They waited for me to bow my head, to thank them, to backtrack. I didn't. Instead, I smiled, a calm, level smile that even surprised me. I gathered my papers, reached into my bag, and placed a cream-colored envelope on the table. Thick, neat, no label on the outside. "Thank you for your time," I said evenly. "I think things will be clearer in a few days." No one asked what was inside. They assumed it was a report or maybe a vacation request. I said goodbye, turned, and walked out, leaving their curious glances behind me. When the door closed, I drew a deep breath. What I felt wasn't anger, it was released. I'd been preparing for this moment for months. That envelope didn't contain a resignation letter. It was a formal job offer from Medicor Systems, Novatech's biggest rival. The offer came with double my salary and leadership over their next generation surgical robotics initiative. I hadn't signed it yet, but my decision was already made. That meeting wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was the final test, proof of how Novatech truly saw me. And they had answered, loud and clear. As I stepped into the elevator, the image of Victor's smirk still flickered in my mind. I pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors closed, sealing off the laughter, sealing off 6 years of my life at Novatech. I looked at my phone. On the screen was a draft email, subject line, "Accepting Medicor's offer." My thumb hovered over send, then stopped. Not today. I still had a few things to set in order. I wanted to leave standing tall, not bitter, not sneaky, just honest. I gave them value, they dismissed it, and now I'm moving on. When the elevator opened, I drew another breath. Outside, the May sunlight was bright and merciless. In my bag, that envelope sat quietly, like a promise, like a fuse waiting for the right moment to ignite. Have you ever felt that way? That moment when you walk out of a room, leaving behind not just the dismissive stares, but a whole chapter of who you used to be. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe a small cafe in Seattle, maybe stuck in traffic on a Texas freeway, or curled up on your sofa somewhere quiet in Ohio. But if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever stayed silent because it wasn't the right time, then you'll understand. My story began with an envelope on a table. What came after changed everything. I still remember the way the sunlight reflected off the glass as I walked out of the Novatech building that day, that mix of freedom and bitterness in the air. But my calmness wasn't accidental. It didn't come from indifference. It came from preparation. Every move I made that morning, from the way I presented the data to the moment I placed that envelope on the table, had been mapped out months in advance. That afternoon, I didn't go straight home. I drove to a quiet cafe on a corner in Cherry Creek, the place I always went when I needed to think clearly. No colleagues, no curious stares, just the low hum of soft music and the sound of my own breathing. I ordered a latte, opened my laptop, and logged into my personal email. The subject line was still there: job offer, strictly confidential. It was from Olivia Tran, the CEO of Medicore Systems. I'd received that email 17 days earlier at 10:42 at night, right when I was typing up a performance analysis report for Novatech. I still remember the shock of seeing her name in my inbox. "We've been following your work quietly for some time," Olivia wrote. "The precision and innovation in your calibration method are becoming an unofficial industry standard, even though you haven't been publicly credited. I think it's time we talk." 2 weeks before the review meeting, I met Olivia for the first time at a small Japanese restaurant downtown. She didn't waste words. Medicore was preparing to develop a new standard for surgical robotics, pushing for near-perfect precision in microsurgery. "We want you to lead that project," she said. "Not as another mid-level engineer working in the shadows, but as someone setting the new rules of the game." I remember falling silent after that. Not because I doubted her, but because no one at Novatech had ever told me I could set the rules. Olivia went on. "I'm not just talking about salary, though it will reflect your worth. I'm talking about influence, ownership, authority." I didn't give her an answer that night. I needed time, not to think about the offer, but to test my own loyalty. 6 years is a long time. I used to think I owed Novatech something. My first opportunity, my first belief in myself. But the truth was, I had already paid that debt, with sleepless nights, emergency calls at 3 in the morning, and canceled vacations to keep testing cycles on track. I told one person, my closest friend at the company, Jess, the head of quality control. We sat on the grassy lawn behind the office one afternoon, eating lunch a week before the review. "I think I'm leaving," I said. Jess stopped chewing. "You're serious? Where to?" "Medicore," I said quietly. "They're building a new surgical robot system and want me to design the calibration standard. It's a big project." "Oh my God," Jess whispered. "You know this place will collapse without you, right?" I smiled faintly. "They won't collapse because I leave. They'll collapse because they never come." Built a system strong enough to survive without one person. Jess didn't argue. She knew I was right. Back at the cafe today, I opened the Medicore contract again. The numbers were clear: double the salary, plus equity in the project. But what truly sealed it was a single line at the bottom of page 3. Technical standards. Authority has the full right to propose, approve, and publish internal documentation within the project scope. Author, Samantha Lee. For the first time in my career, my name would be officially attached to what I created. I opened a new email window and began typing. To Olivia Tran. Subject, acceptance body. Olivia, thank you for the trust and the opportunity. I'm ready to begin this new chapter with Medicor. I'll need 2 weeks to transition out of Novatech. See you soon. Samantha. I hit send. When I stood up to leave, a soft breeze swept through the street, carrying a few cherry blossom petals across the sidewalk. The city kept buzzing, people rushing forward, unaware of what had just shifted inside a quiet corner cafe. But I knew. And Medicor knew. Novatech didn't. Not yet. But they would, and when they did, it would already be too late. 3 days had passed since the review meeting. 3 days since I had placed that envelope on the table, walked out of the conference room, and stepped into the light. I still came to work on time, did my job with the same precision and professionalism as always. I didn't say a word about leaving, didn't act any differently. All I needed was silence long enough for everything to reveal itself. On Tuesday morning, Victor sent out an internal email calling for an urgent meeting at 9:30. The subject line read simply, Q3 Technical Strategy. But I knew this wasn't a normal meeting. 30 minutes earlier, MedTech Business had published a headline. Samantha Lee joins Medicor Systems as lead developer of calibration standards for next-generation surgical robotics. They hadn't used my photo. I hadn't given a statement. But that single line was enough to turn the entire office into a pressure chamber. When I walked into the meeting room, this time as someone already halfway out the door, the air was thick with tension. Victor looked at me for the first time in 3 days. No smug smile this time, just the faint strain behind his measured expression. Samantha, he began, his voice low. We came across an interesting article this morning. It seems you've made a career move. I took my seat, opened my notebook. I haven't made an official announcement yet, but yes, I've accepted an offer from Medicor. I'll be leaving Novatech in 2 weeks. No one spoke. The same people who had stayed silent during the review now looked at me like they had just lost something irreplaceable. We want to understand what happened, Ellen said finally. We may have reacted poorly in that meeting, but you're an essential part of this team. We'd like to keep you. I nodded slowly. I understand. But this decision didn't come from a single meeting. It came from 6 years. Victor exhaled, showing fatigue for the first time. You realize this will set us back. You're leading the entire calibration system for the Nova X line. If you leave mid-trial, we'll lose progress. The documentation is standardized. I'll complete a full handover, I said evenly. I have no intention of leaving anyone to clean up after me. Victor turned to Mark, the VP of Engineering, who had barely spoken during the review. He looked older now, as if the past 3 days had aged him a decade. He met my eyes and gave a small nod, the first genuine gesture of respect I had seen from him in years. But the tension in that room was only the beginning. That afternoon, I got a message from Jess. Be careful, Rick's furious. Rick, the deputy director of engineering, had never liked me. He was the type who believed I cut corners to get attention with my so-called flashy innovations. And now he was the one inheriting everything I left behind. He was not pleased. It wasn't just that I was leaving, it was who I was leaving for. Medicor, the same competitor Rick had once mocked as underqualified, was now the company that wanted me to lead a standard he had failed to establish himself. He knew exactly what that meant. The next morning, I passed by the glass conference room on the 10th floor and saw Rick in a meeting with legal. No one said a word, but their eyes followed me as I walked by. The look wasn't internal anymore, it was adversarial. That night, Jess called. Rick told the team you might have used internal data to negotiate with Medicor, she said quickly. I don't think they'll file a lawsuit, but they're definitely trying to hold you back or pressure Medicor to drop the deal. I was silent for a moment. I've prepared for that possibility, I said. I didn't take anything from Novatech except my experience and myself. Jess sighed. I know, I'm just worried. So am I said. But I don't regret it. Her worry wasn't misplaced. The next day, an internal email leaked to a tech blog. No sender, no traceable source. The message suggested that I had acted unethically by leaving Novatech for a direct competitor. The post spread fast across LinkedIn. Industry people started commenting. A few former clients reached out to ask what was going on. Medicor stayed silent, but I knew they were holding meetings, assessing the risk. I might have become a pawn in a much bigger game. That was when I realized the train had already left the station, and Novatech was desperate to climb back on, no matter the cost. What they didn't know was that I wasn't walking into this alone. I had prepared, I had witnesses, I had principles, and most of all, I had the truth on my side. The central exhibit hall at Novatech felt thick with air that day. Cold fluorescent lights picked out the gleam of metal edges on the display robots. People moved past each other in silence, ghosts in a company quietly shaking apart. When I stepped into the lobby, my phone buzzed. Message: Press is running a story saying I transferred proprietary technology. It hit like a stone dropped into a still pond, ripples spreading everywhere. The night before, Tech Pulse Daily ran a headline: Former Novatech engineer took robot data to Medicor. Breach of NDA? The story ran my photo from a Novatech meeting beside the Medicor logo and quoted an anonymous source inside Novatech accusing me of taking calibration devices, technical documents, and internal code to the rival. The claim spread fast across forums, LinkedIn, Twitter, and even private industry groups. Medicor called an emergency meeting. Project leaders, legal, and PR filed into headquarters early the next morning. Olivia showed up tense, the first time I saw fatigue in her eyes, though she kept her leadership steady. "We need to move fast," she told the room. "We verify the allegations, gather evidence, and if necessary, respond publicly. Samantha, I want you to work closely with legal and communications. We must control the narrative." I nodded and felt like I was stepping onto a new battlefield. My contract with Medicor included clauses protecting my authorship, but that felt small once an opponent had fired the first rounds with the press. I knew the next steps would decide my reputation, my career, and the standing of women engineers in the field. That afternoon, a reporter from Medical Tech Insider called. Jenna Ward asked to interview me at 1 p.m. the next day. I knew it could be a trap, my words edited or taken out of context, but if I stayed away, they would say I was hiding. I agreed and prepared thoroughly, drafting answers and rehearsing with Medicor lawyers overnight. On camera, studio lights, microphones, and the crew surrounded me. Jenna introduced the segment and asked, "Samantha Lee, did you bring Novatech internal data to Medicor to build the new robot?" I looked straight into the lens and said calmly, "No. I did not take a single line of code beyond what I handed over appropriately before leaving. Everything I use at Medicor is based on knowledge, experience, and independent research I developed over 6 years. My work at Novatech was never publicly credited under my name." She asked if I had verification. I showed the materials the comms team prepared, internal emails, handover reports, and statements from Novatech engineers and managers confirming I completed an honest, transparent handover. I published copies of my signatures on old Novatech contracts to show there was no removal of devices or code. The interview ran longer than planned, and for the first time in days, I felt grounded. I did not rage, I did not lash out. I simply told the truth. After the episode aired, expert commentary began to swell in support. Medicor amplified the clip and posted documentation across industry social channels, attaching evidence from Novatech staff. Novatech did not stay quiet. They pushed a follow-up on industry leaks alleging I had a secret relationship with a Medicor director before I left, and they published forged emails and misquoted lines claiming I intended to take calibration code into Medicor to speed development. Some engineers called me a traitor. Some clients asked tough legal questions. Medicor's comms team responded with an explainer titled, "Who is Samantha Lee?" laying out proof and offering to cooperate with any investigation. They reached out to partner hospitals to verify contract status. At home, I could not sleep. I rechecked every email, every signature, and every engineer certification from Novatech colleagues I had worked with. I told myself if anyone at Novatech had ever relied on me during a midnight surgery panic, they would step forward. Then an unexpected message appeared on Novatech's engineering network from a former teammate. "I am willing to testify for Samantha." She handed over everything. Another anonymous source emailed Medicor, "I am the engineer responsible for Nova Surge calibration." Samantha handed that module over before she left. "I can verify it technically." It was a small light in the storm. They could not make me fight alone. I was not alone. That afternoon, Novatech sent an internal bulletin asking staff to report any information regarding recent leaks. I received the memo in the same thread, plain evidence they knew I was reading. Maybe they were panicking. I was not afraid. I had prepared for this fight not to punish, but to prove that truth can win when the storyteller stays quiet long enough and brings evidence at the right moment. I learned something in those chaotic days between headlines and suspicion. Truth needs time and preparation. The accusations that I had taken confidential files to Medicor had spread across the industry like an oil slick, and I knew that to clear it, words alone wouldn't be enough. I needed evidence, and I had it. Right after my live interview with Jenna aired, I received a short email from Medicor's legal team. We've initiated an independent verification process. Olivia said nothing more in that day's meeting, but her firm nod, the way she didn't blink as I laid out my handover documents, told me everything. They stood with me, not just because I was honest, but because they knew exactly what I brought to the table. The investigation began with hard proof, physical copies of signed handover sheets, a video of my final internal presentation at Novatech, and digital signatures confirming my uploads to their technical archive. Medicor's technical audit team, alongside 3 independent legal specialists, examined every line of data used in the new robot project and compared it against Novatech's database. They found zero overlap. Every algorithm I used at Medicor was built from my own upgraded models, refinements of designs I had once proposed and that Novatech rejected as impractical. I had kept my promise to myself never to take what isn't mine, and now that integrity was no longer invisible, it was provable. Meanwhile, messages from former Novatech employees continued to arrive quietly but steadily. One engineer sent an audio recording from an internal meeting last year, the one where I presented my calibration protocol, and Rick, the deputy director of engineering, dismissed it outright for being too costly. That recording captured everything, my voice presenting the very concept Medicor was now using. It proved that I had publicly shared the idea before, and Novatech had rejected it. The same company is now accusing me of stealing something they once refused to value. A week after the investigation began, Medicor released its internal report clearing my name. The accompanying press statement read, "We have full confidence in the integrity of our engineering team. Ms. Samantha Lee has not violated any ethical or legal provisions concerning intellectual property. The NovaGen project is an original development, a testament to engineering skill, not theft." The report spread quickly. Senior engineers across the field spoke in support. Major hospitals wrote letters affirming continued partnership with Medicor. I didn't smile, didn't celebrate. I just sat alone in my office reading the final line of the report. Evidence confirms that all data, tools, and methods used by Samantha Lee were derived from personal expertise and independent research, unrelated to proprietary material from Novatech devices. But it wasn't over. Another engineer, Paul, once Rick's assistant, sent me an email. "There's something you should see. Rick asked me to delete a few files from the system before you left. I kept a backup. Inside that backup was the original calibration manual I wrote, but the author field had been edited. Instead of Samantha Lee, the metadata read Rick J. Howard. A clumsy mistake, since Rick had never worked on that module, and I had full training footage showing me explaining the specifications to the engineering team. I never sent that document outside the company. They had removed my name and kept the revised version as their fabricated proof against me. Now, the truth was undeniable. Medicor's legal division moved immediately. They filed a counterclaim against Novatech for defamation, misrepresentation, and intellectual property misuse, and requested an independent ethics review from an industry legal board. This time, it wasn't just me defending myself. It was a battle between 2 corporations, and I was the spark. I sat in my Denver office, looking out the window at the streets below. People walked, cars passed. The city moved as if nothing had changed. But inside that glass tower, a moral war was unfolding. Between 2 of the biggest medical technology companies in the country, I knew it. And I knew it was no longer just about me. This was about every engineer who had ever written thousands of lines of code, designed prototypes, created innovations, only to have their names erased under developed by the company. It was for those who had sat in conference rooms, reached for recognition, and been laughed at. I wasn't fighting just for my name, I was clearing the path for those who would come after, so that when they walk away from a company, they won't have to bow their heads in fear of being branded disloyal, but can hold them high, knowing that worth isn't defined by where you leave, but by how you leave. And I had left, the right way. I had been at Medicor for less than 8 weeks, yet not once did I feel like a newcomer. It wasn't because I had already adapted to the culture. It was because, for the first time in my career, I had real authority, something 6 years at Novatech had never given me. In my first week, Olivia called me into a closed meeting with the research team: 5 senior engineers, 2 data specialists, and a consulting surgeon. On the whiteboard were numbers I recognized instantly: positional deviation in surgical robotics, small enough to go unnoticed by most, but enough to make my pulse quicken. The axis drift is higher than expected on several models, Mason, the lead engineer explained. We suspect inconsistent calibration from component suppliers. I said nothing, but the pieces were already clicking together in my mind. We spent the next 2 weeks checking every module currently in use across 3 major hospitals, and as I suspected, the fault wasn't in the components. It was in the calibration process itself, used as a cost-saving shortcut. Many machines were being checked only once a month, some once every 3 months, to minimize downtime. I remembered all the times I had been ignored at Novatech when I warned that even a few micrometers of deviation could throw off a robot's position during delicate eye or heart procedures. They told me I was overthinking it, and now that same overthinking stood right in front of me, except this time, I had the power to act. I presented my plan to Olivia: build a new calibration standard, not just for Medicore's systems, but for the entire industry. Instead of each hospital or manufacturer enforcing its own rules, we would create a shared framework: measurable, transparent, and untamperable. I want this standard to become a firewall against technical negligence, I said. Olivia nodded. Start it, she said simply. Within 3 weeks, we completed the first draft of the NovaGen Precision Standard 1.0, or NPS. It included weekly calibration checks instead of monthly, automated logging requirements, deviation alerts beyond threshold, and, most importantly, real-time axis tracking sensors. It meant that each surgical robot would not only be calibrated once, but would continuously self-monitor and automatically send performance reports to Medicore's central system. If a deviation happens at 3 in the morning during an emergency surgery in Houston, the system will detect it before the surgeon even realizes, I said during our internal presentation. And that is the difference between trust and liability. 2 days later, Medicore officially released NPS as the default standard for all new robotic surgery products. They didn't force adoption, but published the framework publicly and free of charge for any institution to reference. 10 leading hospitals across the United States were invited to participate in the early evaluation program. The results came fast. Within 10 days, 4 major hospitals requested consultation to transition their systems to NPS, one of them being Montclair Medical Center, a long-term client of Novatech. I received an internal email from Medicore's market analysis team. Novatech just lost the Montclair account. They're now under review across multiple contracts. I read the line with a heavy calm. Not regret, just awareness. This was only the beginning. Novatech stayed silent publicly, but within the professional circle, whispers began. Doctors started posting on LinkedIn about losing confidence in outdated calibration protocols. A technical blogger wrote that manufacturers should remove trade secret barriers around safety standards. I never mentioned Novatech by name, but they knew exactly who I was referring to. A week later, at a medical technology conference in Dallas, I gave my first official keynote on NPS before an audience of over 400 surgeons and engineers. After the talk, as I stepped down from the stage, I saw a familiar face: Mark, Novatech's former VP of engineering. He stood quietly at the back of the hall. No greeting, no signal, just a look that said everything they hadn't had the courage to say before: we were wrong. But none of them had said it when I was still there. Back at Medicor, I felt something I had never felt before: a sense of ownership. For the first time, I was building something that carried my name, my vision. No longer the invisible contributor behind reports, no longer the name crossed out by a technical director. I wasn't seeking revenge on Novatech. I didn't need to, because their own arrogance and stagnation were already doing the job for me. I thought I had prepared myself for every possible reaction from Novatech: a media counterattack, a technical rebuttal, even a lawsuit. But I didn't expect what happened that Tuesday afternoon when the office phone rang and the caller ID lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months: Victor Kane. I stared at the screen, not because I hesitated, but because a part of me couldn't believe he would call me directly. I picked up. Samantha. His voice came through, lower and more cautious than the last time I heard it. I know this call might make you uncomfortable, but I hope you'll give me 2 minutes. I said nothing. Victor, the CEO of Novatech, the man who once looked at me with disdain when I asked for a pay adjustment, the man who mocked me for daring to state my worth, was now speaking softly. I'm listening, I said evenly. He cleared his throat. We're making some internal changes, and clearly, you've proven something that, to be honest, many of us underestimated. I stayed silent. We'd like to invite you back, he continued, as technical director. You'd oversee all of R&D, competitive pay, equity, full authority. You'd have the freedom to build whatever you want. I let out a quiet laugh, not out of amusement, but at the irony of it all. 6 months ago, I had sat in their boardroom with a simple request to align my salary with industry standards. They didn't even open my file. Now, they wanted me back to save a sinking ship. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I've found a place where my voice doesn't need to shout to be heard. Victor paused. I could almost see him leaning back in his chair, closing his eyes the way he always did when something caught him off guard. I understand, he said. But Samantha, if this is about what happened, I just want to say we were wrong. I was wrong. It was the first time he had ever admitted it. But apologies don't rewrite history. For 6 years, no one had stepped forward to defend me. No one had spoken up when they knew I was being undervalued. They hadn't stood beside me when it mattered. They came only when I had something they thought they could reclaim. It's not about what happened, I said. It's about the fact that I no longer need your approval. I hung up before he could say another word. That night, an email arrived from Ellen, the former CFO, the one who had seemed sympathetic during my review but never said a word on my behalf. Her message was short. We're restructuring. Rick has been terminated. Mark has resigned. The board has instructed us to restore what should never have been lost. If you change your mind, the door is always open. I reread the phrase, restore what should never have been lost. It was true and far too late. 3 days later, during an internal meeting at Medicor, Olivia handed me a new market report. Novatech's slowing down, she said. They're trying to adopt the NPS standard, but their hardware can't keep up. They've sent a request for technical consultation through a third-party firm. I looked up at her. Olivia smiled slightly. And guess who they requested to lead the project? You. I said nothing. We're not taking it, she continued, her tone calm but firm. Not because of a conflict of interest, but because you don't need to go back there as a savior. You're the one who set the standard, not the one who needs to fix those who ignored it. I nodded, relieved. I knew Medicor well enough to trust that they wouldn't turn personal history into business, and that they had enough integrity to avoid working with anyone who lacked technical ethics. A week later, I received a package. No sender listed, but the contents made it obvious. Inside was a printed proposal on thick paper and a handwritten note from Victor. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking you to consider this for the young engineers who need a leader who knows what's right. It was the only line from him I couldn't dismiss completely. But I knew I didn't need to return to lead anyone out of the shadows of old decisions. If I wanted to help young engineers, I'd do it another way, by building a transparent, fair system right where I stood. I folded the letter, placed it in my drawer, and never replied. The next day, at an international ethics conference, I presented a new proposal, a system for personal recognition of technical contributions, independent of corporate ownership. I began my talk with one simple line. Sometimes what's right comes too late, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't begin now. In the audience, many nodded. In the back row, I saw a familiar face, Paul, the engineer who had helped clear my name. And I understood. I wasn't going back to rewrite the past. I was building a future where no one else would have to live it. When I walked out of the hall after that presentation, I received more handshakes than at any other conference I'd ever attended. But what stayed with me most was the look in the eyes of a young engineer, maybe 25 at most, standing at the corner of the hallway, clutching a notebook. As I passed, she said softly, "Thank you." I thought engineers like us would never be truly recognized. I nodded and smiled, but her words cut deep. They reminded me of how many times I had felt exactly the same way. Since Medicor officially turned down Novatech's offer, I knew one thing for sure. My individual influence had limits. If I really wanted to change how this industry treated its engineers, especially those who weren't managers or corporate politicians, I needed to build a system that could exist independently of any company. I started with the people I knew best, my old engineering circles. I wrote private letters to nearly 30 former colleagues, from Novatech to Medicor, from those who had stood by me to those who had stayed silent. I blame no one. I just asked, if there were a system that recognized individual technical contributions, would you support it? Would you take part in testing it? Within 72 hours, 25 replied. 21 said yes. I called it ARC, Acknowledgement and Recognition for Contributors. It was a system that recorded personal technical contributions, whether it was a short line of code, a circuit tweak, or an improvement to internal documentation. Anything that created value would be logged with the contributor's name. No titles, no PR filters, no managers deciding who got mentioned in company newsletters. If you built it, your name stayed on it. We began with a simple platform. Each engineer had a personal profile where every contribution was described briefly, time-stamped, and verified by peers, team leads, or internal clients. Anyone could nominate someone else for recognition. Once validated, the record received a contribution badge, creating a living technical portfolio detached from corporate ownership. ARC would be living proof of real value, I said at the first internal briefing, not filtered through HR metrics or KPI charts. At first, Olivia was cautious. If this grows, she asked, won't it diminish the authority of leadership? On the contrary, I told her, it will reveal who the real leaders are, the ones who create value, not the ones who just report it. She nodded, and Medicor became the first company to pilot ARC. I led the implementation myself. After 3 weeks, we had logged over 300 individual contributions, from small fixes like cutting a robot's operating system boot time by 1.2 seconds, to major breakthroughs like a self-calibrating sensor algorithm for surgeries lasting over 4 hours. The quietest engineers, the ones who rarely spoke or showed up in reports, were now being named in team meetings. Some were being recognized for the first time in their careers. That feeling, seeing your name attached to something you built, confirmed by peers, recorded in a system that no one can erase or attribute to the collective, was something I had wished for long ago. News of ARC spread faster than I expected. Within a month, 4 other companies reached out asking for documentation. One, a medical device firm in Boston, wanted to use ARC as part of their annual performance review. I refused to make it proprietary. I wanted ARC to be open source, free to use, as long as no one turned it into a product or a control mechanism. ARC exists to protect engineers, not to manage them, I said clearly. Not everyone was thrilled. Some traditional executives pushed back, saying individual credit would divide teams and harm collective culture. A team is strong when each individual is seen, I countered. A team built on silence is just a form of complicity. I knew I was going against the current, but I wasn't alone. Jess, my friend from Novatech, now works as a technical manager at a small medical device startup in Oregon. She called to say her company wanted to use ARC but didn't have enough people to run it. You don't need a team, I told her. You just need one principle to start with. Every engineer has a name. That line later became ARC's unofficial slogan. 2 months later, I was invited to speak at the National Engineering Alliance Summit, attended by more than 2,000 people, from executives to independent engineers. In my talk, I didn't mention myself. I told the story of an unnamed engineer who once improved a robot's control software, but was never credited in the company newsletter. She later resigned, and the company had to hire 3 people just to understand what she had done alone. When I finished, the entire hall stood and applauded. That night, I sat alone in my office, looking at ARC's dashboard. The numbers read 1,237 engineers, 5,314 contributions, 713 recognitions. Each number was a story, living proof that silence does not mean invisibility, and that true contribution doesn't need to shout to be heard. I remembered Victor's words in his letter. We need a leader who knows what's right. At the time, I thought he meant coming back, but now I understand. I had already become that leader, not at Novatech, but here, where I could build a system that no one could ever use to erase another person's work. A year after my first presentation about ARC, I stood before the largest audience of my career, the 48th International Engineering Conference held in San Diego. Nearly 3,000 attendees, rows upon rows of engineers, experts, senior managers, and newly graduated students. A miniature version of the industry I once believed would never notice my name. I was introduced not by title or credentials, but with one simple line: the woman who taught the engineering world how to recognize contributions the right way. I walked onto the stage, calm. The past year has shaped me more than any before it. I was no longer the Samantha who once sat in a meeting, humiliated for asking for a fair raise, but someone who now stood before a new generation, knowing her voice carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it had structure behind it. I began my speech not with data, but with a story. I once left a company where my name never appeared in a single official technical document, even though I wrote most of them. I had watched talented colleagues stay silent because they didn't want to be seen as troublemakers in the name of team culture, and I once believed I would always be a shadow behind someone else's success. The room grew quiet. Then I said, "But I learned something. We don't have to break the system. We can build another one, clearer, fairer. And if enough people choose the new one, the old one will collapse on its own." I introduced ARC version 2.0, now integrated with open source blockchain to ensure that no contribution, once verified, could ever be deleted or altered. I shared the numbers. More than 6,000 engineers had joined. Nearly 20 companies were testing it, and several technical universities were integrating ARC into their curriculum on ethics and fairness in engineering. But what made me proudest wasn't the numbers. It was that Novatech had become the 15th company to adopt ARC after months of silence and internal turmoil. I hadn't reached out to them, and they hadn't reached out to me, but a former colleague who now leads a team there forwarded me their internal newsletter. It announced a new program. We are committed to fully recognizing every individual technical contributor, including those from completed projects. Below it was a list of nearly 40 names. Mine appeared 3 times. A link to the 3 projects I once led, the ones I had thought would forever be swallowed by the collective culture that erased individual credit. When I saw my name there, I didn't feel triumph. Not forgiveness either, just closure, because I no longer needed it. But I knew those still there did, and if my leaving had opened that door for them, then every wound, every silence, every rejected call, every sleepless night writing documentation no one read had been worth it. After the talk, I stepped outside into the courtyard where the California sunlight fell on my shoulders like a quiet congratulations. A hand waved from across the crowd. Jess, the friend who had walked with me through every stage, from our old Novatech lab to that late night cafe where I'd said, "I'm leaving." Now she was leading a technical team in Oregon and one of the first to integrate IARC into her hiring process. "Remember when we argued about what success meant?" she asked, as we sat on a park bench outside the conference hall. I nodded. Back then, we thought it was getting a raise or a decent boss. Jess laughed softly. "And now?" I looked out toward the beach, where the sunlight shimmered across the water like a reflection of my life, no longer rushed, no longer bitter, just clear. Now, I said, I think success is when you can walk away, and no one else has to be treated the way you once were. Jess didn't say anything more. We sat quietly, letting the ocean wind move through our hair, letting time pass like a silent confirmation that some battles don't need to end in applause. They just need to end in change that lasts. That night, before leaving San Diego, I opened my personal email. A new message appeared from a young engineer named Carla. I just got recognized for the first time in my career. No one clapped. But I feel seen. Thank you for creating RC. I read it 3 times, then smiled to myself. Maybe you're hearing this on your commute, during your lunch break, or in the middle of the night when everything feels unfair. If you've ever felt invisible in your own work, seen someone else's name on your results, or stayed silent because you hope someone would notice someday, I hope my story reminds you that you're not wrong for wanting credit. You're not weak for wanting your name known, and you're not selfish for standing up for what's right. I'm Samantha Lee. I was once laughed at for asking for a fair raise after 6 years of work. I walked away. And then I built something new, not just for myself, but for an entire system. Because I believe this: those who seek revenge win once, but those who rebuild change the game forever.